Hello, everybody. You're listening to my podcast, Suchitra's Life, with me, Suchitra. And in this episode, you'll be listening to my conversation with Varun Raj, who is a game designer with over 8 years of experience. And when he's not playing games, he's most probably thinking about them. He also loves to explore other mediums like movies, books, and TV shows. So let's dive into our conversation. Hi, Varun.
Hello, Suchitra.
Welcome to my podcast. How are you doing today?
I'm doing good. Happy to be here.
Yes. And you are a game designer, right?
Yeah, that's correct.
So how did you got into this? Like when I hear the term designer, it's mostly like I see UI UX designers in the market, but my acquaintance with game designers is very less. So you're probably the first in my life, a game designer that I'm interacting with. So
Okay.
tell me a bit about how you got into it and all of that.
So, it's very simple, really. I played a lot of games since I was a kid, and and my parents, I was fortunate enough to get access to a computer game console, so I was able to play a variety of games, and eventually, I found out that there's different types of games that are being made, and I found an interest, and generally it had this it invoked this curiosity in me to try different games, to play different games and see what they're doing.
Mm-hmm.
And eventually, I had a certain understanding of what are the different types of games, how do they play out, what is the flow, so that sort of thing. And at some point in life I decided, okay, I want to be a game developer. And eventually, after graduation, I didn't do any course on game design as such. I just did an engineering course. So after graduation, I came across a job for a junior game design role at a studio in Hyderabad.
Mm-hmm.
And I looked at the JD, the job description, and it looked like something I could do. So I interviewed there, and fortunately, they gave me an internship, a 3 month internship,
Okay.
and the rest, as they say, is history.
Mm-hmm. So,
So until that point, I didn't know much about game design, as a profession.
oh,
And if it was after I had started working that I learned more and more about it. So much of my internship was spent, actually, even to this day, much of my time is being spent on studying studying game design basically.
interesting. So,
Yeah.
before you decided that, okay, games is what I'm going to design, what all you wanted to be in your life, like before you stumbled on this career?
Oh, so I think the earliest thing I remember saying is that I wanted to be a scientist because I was really interested in science, basically, the subject science in school, basically. And uh, so I'd be very active in class during science class, not as much active in the other classes, but still. So I had like sort of this reputation in school that I'm a scientist, or I'm going to be a scientist, and everyone would just call me that. Eventually, you grow older, you get introduced to new things, and you talk to different people. And eventually I decided, I want to be an automobile engineer because I was really interested in cars. And I used to look at cars on the streets, and I try to recognize every single car that I see on the streets. And I feel like, I had a knack for it, and I thought like an automobile engineer would be interesting. And in general,
Hmm.
I'd be looking into car magazines as well, and
Oh.
I'd be looking at what kind of cars, what kind of fast cars were there out there. So I'd be very, it's very, very common for kids, a lot of boys my age at that time, during teenage years, that, we would look at cars, and we would look at all the different types of cars. So that was one phase of life where I thought, okay, I want to be an automobile engineer. And then this is also around the time I was really getting into playing different types of games. And so I was also being introduced to video games simultaneously as this was happening.
Ooh.
So during this phase, at some point, as I kept playing more games, I decided, the game development makes a lot more sense, and it sounded much more interesting for me. And I played so many games, I wanted to make my own game too. So
Mm.
that came in naturally.
So, what are some of your favorite games that just blew your mind off?
Um, so one of the games that I find really inspiring at the time was this game called God Hand on the PlayStation 2. So, so PlayStation 2 is basically Sony's second PlayStation console, home console.
Mm-hmm.
So that generation saw a variety of unique and interesting 3D games because that's when 3D design was fully developed, and we had powerful enough hardware to run 3D games. And so there were a lot of interesting 3D games at that time, and God Hand was one such game. And it is basically like this over the top brawler. So I found it interesting because of how challenging the combat was, and it had a very interesting setup of different scenarios where you actually feel like you're this. It sounds really mundane when I put it, but you really feel like someone a hero of this very destined action movie basically. And I found it, I felt like it captured a certain feeling and in a very interesting way, and I felt like it also maintained that challenge while doing so. So it was one of the games that I found very inspiring.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Besides that, there was also Resident Evil 4. So Resident Evil 4 is a survival horror game. Basically, you are a police officer who's fighting off a zombie invasion, zombie infestation, basically.
Mm-hmm.
And it's another very challenging experience where you have to micromanage a lot of your resources, and also you have to there's a sense of tension in every situation. For
Mm-hmm.
whatever reason, I really enjoy that tension, and so that was another game that I really liked growing up. So that game, incidentally, was remade recently. It's going to release this month. It's also called Resident Evil 4.
Mm. Okay.
So yeah, the game's out. I just played the demo yesterday, and I just completed the demo. I couldn't buy the game though, but
Mm-hmm.
yeah, it's interesting.
Uh,
So these are a couple of games that I found very inspiring. Uh, Besides these, I'm sure there's a lot more, but these are a couple of games that I could think of at the top of my head.
wow, that's
Mm.
interesting. Because
Mm.
if you ask me what all games that I've played in my life, I would say this Mario, Super Mario, and then this Mortal Kombat and other
Mm.
most popular ones. Like I wouldn't even know the games that you're talking about because like for normal people it's just Super Mario and Contra Entry was another game that
Yeah, yeah,
we
yeah,
play with.
yeah. Yeah, yeah. Those are very popular.
Yeah.
Mortal Kombat is Incidentally, Mortal Kombat is also something I played. It's like one of the earliest games that I played.
Hmm.
It's on the PlayStation 1. Um, I used to play it with my sister and my cousin
Hmm.
regularly, and we had some very good memories with that game too.
Yes. Yeah. So back when you started off, Varun, uh,
Yeah,
people knew only this much about games like Super Mario and this and that. And
yeah,
so how did you really see a future to this? Like back then, people didn't really think much about mobile games coming up like the way they are popping right now. Back then,
yeah.
what was the advice you were getting if since you made up your mind to get into this path, what was the advice were you getting, the market trends back then and versus how it is now? Can you just talk a bit about that?
Yeah, yeah. So if you're asking about when I was in high school or college, uh, we are really living in a very different world from back then. and that's mostly thanks to the proliferation of smartphones.
Mm.
So there's a very interesting cultural change that happened when I was growing up and compared to now. So I used to travel in the city bus
Mm-hmm.
around when if I had to commute to college or if I had to commute to school or if I had to commute to work also sometimes.
Yeah.
So there's a dramatic shift in what was happening in the city bus that I noticed from when I was in high school compared to now.
Yes.
And in high school, I saw a lot of people doing almost nothing, sitting in their seats. They would just be looking out the window or reading something or or talking to someone on the phone. But after the smartphone era, which is the iPhone was out in like 2007, 2008. But I think things really picked up after 2012, I guess, 2010, 12.
Mm.
And during this time, what I noticed was I was doing the same thing. I was getting on a bus as always, and what I was noticing was a lot of people were not looking out in the window. They were not talking to anyone. They were not reading anything. They were sitting on their phone. They were using their phone to
Mm-hmm.
play Candy Crush or some other game on mobile.
Ah, yeah. Candy
So
Crush is
yeah, yeah,
everyone's favorite game on the bus.
yeah. Yeah, so I've seen that there's a major cultural shift in the way people, were getting access to mobile phones, and this also had ripple effects in the way they were looking at video games. So there was almost no one that I could talk to when I was in high school about video games, because not many people were very acquainted with it because people didn't have access to consoles or computers or powerful computers to run games. Of course, there'll be certain games that they would be aware of, they would know about, they would have played either as well.
Yeah.
But the kind of enthusiast level interest in games was all largely absent, and it was a very uh, you know difficult time in the sense that it's very hard to find someone who you could talk about games with glee,
Yeah.
and it's also very hard to convince your parents or anyone adult that this is this is a valid hobby, this is an interesting hobby,
Mm-hmm.
and there's chance to make a career out of it because they were largely unaware,
Mm.
right? And they never interacted with something like this. When it comes to movies, music, they had some level of interaction with movies and music because everyone has gone to a theater at least once,
Yeah.
or they listen to some music whether they like it or not. Someone's gonna play music outside,
Mm.
so and there's gonna be some music they like and enjoy. That sort of acquaintance is there, so they have some understanding of different mediums like that. But it was not so with games until the smartphone era, and that's when people started playing games because they had very easy access to it.
Mm.
These games were right in their mobile phones, and they were completely free to. They're not completely free, but they were free to download and start playing. Uh, so they had some acquaintance now. So this helped, this kind of helped in getting that conversation forward about games and the future of games and
Mm.
looking at games in terms of a career path.
Okay, so back
I
then, how did you convince your parents? Because I'm assuming they haven't played any games or anything like whatever you
Well, yeah,
so.
they were never convinced, honestly. So, but it so happened that I they at some point after engineering they realized that this whole interest in video games is never going to die,
Oh,
even after engineering. So they just gave up, you could say.
yeah, nice. So, can you tell us like what are the different categories of games? Like, of course, we are just consumers, so for us, like we wouldn't think so much about the games that we are playing. But I
Hmm.
think it will be great if you tell us like what are the categories of games and how do we, how do you decide like what sort of game to design?
I see, I see. So this quite a few different genre in video games, but the terms that we use for genre are still very broad and still very underdeveloped.
Mm-hmm.
But I can give you a gist of it. Like I mentioned. with a couple of examples I said earlier. Uh, when I say survival horror, there's a certain understanding of what kind of game it is, because
Mhm.
there is a certain level of resource management that happens, because your survival is at stake, and there's a tension
Yeah.
that's happening as a result. And the horror can come in as jump scares, or the atmosphere, or very tense situations, that sort of thing.
True.
So we have terms like that, but they're very broad. Basically, a shooter, a first-person shooter is basically, it's a little more straightforward in some cases. A first-person shooter is, you in first person of a character, and you have a rifle that you can see up front, and you don't see the rest of the body of the character. It's like you're in the shoes of that character, basically,
Mhm.
a first-person shooter.
Yeah.
Third person is a perspective where you can see the entire character, and they might also be doing similar things, but you can see the entire character.
True.
And, similarly, you have fighting games, or arcade style fighting games, where two characters are facing each other in. So the term arcade comes in because these kinds of games are played mostly in arcades.
Mhm.
So the term comes in from there. And you also have stuff like strategy games, where you have to plan out your moves in
Mhm.
a game, and you have to plan out whatever moves you're going to do to make progress,
Mhm.
and gather your army, or build a base or something like that. So it's similar to you being an army general, and you're kind of planning out your the moves for your troops, and where they need to go, what needs to be done,
Mhm.
that sort of thing. So these are some very broad genre that I can explain, but basically you'll have multiple subgenre within these, and some of these subgenre probably don't have their own names either.
Mhm.
But it's something you get when you look at the game. If you played enough games, you'll get there basically.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I just have this one question that I'm curious about. Um,
Yeah.
do you vote for the games that sort of stimulate this strategic thinking in people, or are you like okay with the games that don't really stimulate much but just for fun? Like, what sort of games do you prefer? Do you wanna make your users think hard, or are you like a designer who's gonna just give them some entertainment and fun and all of that?
Um. Hmm. So I there's a few different ways I look at games,
Mm-hmm.
but broadly speaking, I see games as an art form basically.
Oh, okay.
And when I say there's a few different ways I look at games, there's a few different paradigms. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
so when I think of games professionally, I think of them in a certain way. When I think of games, as passion projects, I think of them in a different way. And there are game ideas that I have basically are like, these academic pursuits where, I'm trying to explore a certain concept, and I'm trying to see how that feels
Mm-hmm.
in a certain scenario. So that's more of an academic pursuit for me.
Yeah.
So there's a few game ideas that I have where, I want to see like how this kind of a game feels, and see what kind of experience I get out of it, and see if I can use this kind of a mechanic in another game, in another context.
Mm-hmm.
So, and similarly, like there's a passion perspective as well, where like I have very more well-rounded game ideas where I want to see like how this game, I have a certain specific game idea for a specific genre because I love that genre, and I want to make a game that I would like to play within that genre.
Mm-hmm.
And there's also more specific information like what is the premise of that game, and what is the story of the characters. So that's more of a passion thing, where I have a more concrete idea of how the game is going to be, and I also am acquainted. I'm kind of well aware with the genre in
Mm-hmm.
general, and it's something I want to put out there because I really love the genre, and I really like those kind of games basically.
So, what's your favorite genre?
Um, I play a bit of everything, honestly. Uh, but I do have certain preferences within each genre.
Mm-hmm.
As in, when I say preferences, I do like certain subgenres within those genres.
And
And for example, in strategy games, there's something called tower defense,
mm-hmm.
where you kind of build these, turrets or these defenses around a certain place, and you have to pick out like where to place each defense, each turret, and
Mm-hmm.
make sure like you're putting them in an effective, you're placing them effectively.
Mm-hmm.
So whenever an enemy attacks, the defenses are built in such a way that they have no way to break through the whatever you built.
Oh, okay.
So I really like that subgenre a lot. So I do have like an idea within that subgenre that I wanted to play, that I want to try out.
Mm-hmm.
But that's an example of a passion project mostly. And there's another. So professionally, the way I look at games is similar to the example I gave in the previous question, where I said, the way people, the passengers in the bus,
Mm-hmm.
before mobile games proliferated, and after, the way they were behaving, the way they were in the bus,
Mm-hmm.
it changed dramatically.
Yeah.
And professionally, I want to work on projects that kind of bring that sort of a cultural change in games, and in the way people look at games, or in the way it influences the industry. So that's the kind of projects I look at professionally speaking.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So if I make a game, I would like to see a game that basically is changing the way, everyone around me is looking at games. Everyone around me is looking at a specific genre. Everyone else who's making games are thinking about their games differently. That sort of thing.
Yeah, take us through your game designing process and your role in it specifically.
Okay. Are you asking professionally, or in terms of personal project?
Both ways.
Okay. So professionally, it depends on the project. So if it's a bigger project, there usually are more than one designers. Uh, and so what we do is basically we relegate specific areas of the design to each designer. And there is usually a lead designer, and there's other, designers who work with the lead, who the lead, basically has an overall vision of what the design is going to be like. And the other designers basically, give their idea of, how their specific module of design is going to be like. So there's certain areas of design each designer takes up, if it's a big project, that is.
Okay.
And for example, I'm taking up the economy and systems design for the game, and I basically look at all the currencies that we earn in the game as a reward, and how you spend these currencies, where these currencies go. So you don't end up in a situation where you have too many of a certain currency, and you have just enough, and it feels just right. So that's an example of what an economy design is going to do.
Mm-hmm.
And so similarly, there will be certain other areas of design that other designers might look, or if it's a smaller project, only one designer might look at all of it, like the combat mechanics, how the animation is going to play, what is the frame limit of each animation, that sort of thing.
Oh, okay.
There's different areas in design. If it's a bigger project, multiple designers take it up, or if it's a smaller project, or a single designer is usually enough. And we basically start off with a high level pitch of the design,
Mm-hmm.
and we say, okay, this is the specific, or the general direction we'll be taking for the design. And once we get into an agreement on that direction, we start defining the design direction even more, and we get down to the finer details of the design.
Okay.
So that's how it works. And we start off with a high level pitch, and then we go down to the granular details, and we document it. and we start defining more specific stuff like what are the values going to be for each attribute or each progression. So and it goes a lot of math gets involved too
Mm-hmm.
eventually.
So you
And what is the sorry?
do you love math?
Uh, Math is interesting. That's all I'm going to say. I'm not going to go into the specifics. It can be fun.
Mm-hmm.
It can be fun, and it just takes some patience. Uh, but it can be interesting, math. So yeah, like we go into the finer details, we figure out the logic for each action. Okay, if there is a certain effect we want to have in the game, what is the logic for that effect? When does it trigger? That sort of thing.
Oh, okay.
So we start defining these in the documentation with a lot of details. And once that is okayed, then the programmers can look at the documentation. They can start looking at what they need to do to build such a thing
Mm-hmm.
and what kind of infrastructure they need. And they might come back with us some feedback, and we might have to review the design
Mm-hmm.
based on that feedback. And then it happens. And once we get something playable,
Mm-hmm.
even then we might get a certain amount of feedback and from our own experiences or from someone else's experience, and we have to review the design again.
Oh, okay.
So it's an iterative process that keeps on repeating at different scales as we keep developing, as we keep progressing in the development.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So that's how it works professionally. Personally, I just build the thing that I want to test, the very specific bare bones interaction that I want to create, and then I start fleshing it out even further.
Mm-hmm.
So usually games are built on engines, game engines or software like Unity, Unreal Engine, and you need to be able to program. But these days, these engines are trying to offer much more intuitive and simpler ways to code, uh, like Unreal Engine's blueprints.
Oh.
But you can even find even simpler engines which use a graphical user interface for programming. I think one such engine is Construct 2,
Mm-hmm.
and yeah, so these are the tools that you can use to build the game. Professionally, I don't use them. As in work, I don't use any such. I don't use any tool to build anything. I only work on documentation and spreadsheets. But personally, if I have to build something, it's usually with one of these tools. But it's also possible to build a game entirely on paper.
Oh,
Yeah, so that's basically called paper prototyping in some cases.
okay.
And you can build a game and you can break down the rules to work in like a turn-based scenario
Mm-hmm.
or like a board game.
Mm.
So if you really want to test something, test a certain type of game, you can actually do it on paper as well. If you don't know any game engine or if you don't have the time to build a game on an engine, then this is another alternative you can do. But it gets trickier if you're trying to make an action game where you have to be really fast, and that's not entirely the same as a strategy game.
Mm-hmm.
And you need to have something playable on a on computers or on a computer that you would need to test out for a certain genre.
True.
But yeah, so that's another way of going about it.
Mm-hmm. So far, what kind of games have you designed, be it professional or personal? I mean, if it's not confidential, probably you can just give a gist of.
Yeah. So professionally, I worked on games that are tied with IPs like Adventure Time and Star Trek.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're aware of the famous TV series Star Trek, there is a game on mobile
Mm-hmm.
that we try to build, and this is actually one of the first projects that I ever worked on. It's I was working as one of the writers for the game, and I was also helping design some of the levels.
Oh.
And so I would look at, I would watch some Star Trek, and I would write some story based off, the beats of the TV shows. And I pitched a few stories, I wrote a few stories, and I put them in the game. I got a chance to put them in the game, and it was an interesting experience. And besides that, the other project that I worked on is Adventure Time. Adventure Time is a famous TV show on Cartoon Network,
Oh.
and we built a turn-based strategy game for that, and it also has a character collection aspect. It was on iOS and Android. Same for Star Trek, and I think it's one of the biggest projects for me, where I was looking into almost every aspect of the game. I was looking at all the progression,
Mhm.
uh, the economy, the level design, the combat, and the character design as well sometimes. So it was a very comprehensive experience for me, and it was a very valuable experience. I wouldn't say like these games were really successful. They had their flaws, but
Mhm.
I learned a lot from these projects, and I was fortunate enough to work with IPs like these.
Yeah.
And I would like to, use all the lessons I learned on your projects. And
Mhm.
besides that, I also worked on a cricket game called Cricket Clash. Um, so that was an interesting new spin of cricket, where cricket games are generally very realistic. So we try to make something more that's a lot more casual and a lot more arcadey, in a very simple control scheme.
Mhm.
And so we tried it out and we put it out there, and it had some interesting response from what I can recall. It was a fun game to play and to work on. Besides that, I also worked on a couple of VR projects as well. And these were not exactly games, but they were training simulations for different emergency situations.
Mhm.
So it was another interesting experience where, the client was offering certain scenarios, and we needed to design a level or a place, and we needed to design a flow for, how the scenario begins, how the scenario continues, and how it ends. So that was also an interesting experience. This is completely different from what I was working on previously.
Mhm.
And besides that, I also worked on a lot of word games for a client, and a lot of these were prototypes, and we were trying to build some very interesting takes of popular word game genre that are on mobile. And I'm currently working on something else. It's another big project that
Mhm.
I'm very excited about.
Wow.
Unfortunately, I cannot give many details about it, but it's going to be out when it's going to be out, and
Yeah.
I hope I get to speak about it at some point.